Please be seated. Okay, well, congratulations to the graduates. I'm thrilled to be a part of something that is creating a new generation of Christian leaders. I've got a PhD myself. Had I known they were going to do that tonight, I'd have worn my robe and fit right in. At least I have a black shirt. That kind of qualifies me, doesn't it? Pastor's right. I'm not a preacher. I work in the media business. We essentially jokingly tell people we help Christians not suck at the media. And if you've ever watched much of Christian television or Christian movies, you know I'm a very busy guy. There's a lot of work to be done. I have job security for a very long time. It's interesting, though, when we travel internationally and I tell people we live and work in Hollywood, mostly they assume that my wife and I do this for a living. They don't really get it. They don't really get it. But what I really try to do with my career and the work that we do is help Christians use the media more effectively. We live in a media-driven culture today. Some researchers indicate the average person sees about 5,000 media messages every single day. And I believe that if we're not using media effectively, we'll lose a generation. By the way, do you know the typical adult today checks their phone about 110 times a day? Typical middle schooler, this will freak you out, checks their phone. This is a 12-year-old, checks their phone about 85 times a day. We are completely changing our behavior geared around the digital revolution, and it's doing some remarkable things. So it's interesting, and so I try to help people understand how to use the media to share the gospel. The problem is, Christians, as a rule, don't tell our story very well. We're telling the greatest story ever told, but we just don't tell it well, and I see it everywhere. I went to a church the other day. I think the sign was trying to promote the pastor's sermon series on hell. This is what it said. Do you know what hell is? Come hear our preacher. I don't think that was what they were really trying to communicate. And I discovered I was in the UK last year, and I discovered if you cover up part of your message, it completely changes its meaning. How about this? Jesus is for lease. What? Be careful. And I got a mailer the other day from a Christian organization that feeds hungry kids. They do great work. And I think what the mailer was trying to say, the letter was trying to say was, when you give money to our organization, even after you're dead and gone, it'll still work to help feed hungry kids. I think that's what they meant, but what the letter said was, Mary Ellen died last year. Today she'll feed more than 100 hungry children. Ooh, we just don't tell our story well. I was at a church last year that promoted their youth program, but they weren't paying attention, or they put the sign and it came out like this. Wrong. That is so bad. But the Methodists, very many Methodists, anybody grew up in a Methodist church here? I don't think the Methodists understood the impact of abbreviating their name to fit on a street sign that led to their Bible camp, because that became the Meth Bible Camp. And whatever I tell you tonight, whatever I tell you, do not send your kids to a Meth Bible Camp. It's just a rule. The dead end, they got the dead end right at least, that's for sure. So we don't tell our story well. The truth is the rest of the world doesn't tell their story well. We got a new hardware store in LA where we live near our house. Went into it the other day and I saw this sign, ask an associate for a demonstration. No! I really don't need that demonstration. Thank you very much. What I wanted to talk about tonight was a little different. Normally I talk about media stuff, but I just wrote a book. It literally came out about a month ago called The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How We Get It Back. I think anybody here who's been a Christian for very long understands that Christianity is virtually disappearing from our culture. It's pretty much the same in the United States that it is here in Australia. We've been marginalized. In fact, in the U.S., we've gone from being virtually ignored in the culture to being openly ridiculed. You probably sense it here on late night talk shows, interview programs, in the newspaper, and journalism stories. We're just absolutely made fun of these days. How can a country that's gone as far as we have with the Christian faith, how could it suddenly go away so quickly? And very often, I know both here and in the U.S., we get angry about it. We get frustrated. We're seeing the culture just completely lose Christianity and walk away from it, and we get angry. The problem is anger doesn't help. What I call anger strategies doesn't really work. In America, for instance, we've tried politics. Politics doesn't work. You know, in the U.S. and probably here too, the country's pretty much evenly divided between conservative and liberal. In the U.S., Republican, Democrat. The minute you start aligning the gospel with a certain political party, you just alienated half the country. How does that help the cause of Christ? It doesn't. Then we got mad. We thought that might work. You don't say Merry Christmas, by golly, we're not going to buy your coffee. Boy, that made a real impact for the gospel, huh? Then a lot of churches and ministries tried boycotts. There was a famous boycott of a huge studio in Los Angeles a few years ago. Big denomination in the U.S. boycotted the studio. During the 7 years they boycotted the studio's profits went up, went through the roof. It made the Christians look like idiots. I mean, if boycotts worked, why don't missionaries do it? Let's go to a third world country, surround a tribe, hold up signs, call them names, criticize them. Boy, that'll win them to Jesus, right? You know, it doesn't work there. It's not going to work in Hollywood or any other community for that matter. We have to learn to change the way we approach the culture. I'm all about helping us understand how we engage. So I have a close friend, Jonathan Bach. He has one of the biggest marketing companies in LA. We're both Christians. We go to the same church. We've been studying how we've lost this incredible relationship with the culture. There's a huge gap out there. We looked at the fruit of the Spirit. It's really interesting. The New Testament calls it the fruit of the Spirit. You know the list: patience, gentleness, kindness. You ask a non-believer what they think about Christians, they never mention those kind of words. I mean, the fruit of the Spirit are things we're supposed to be known for, right? If you go to a non-believer and you say, what do you think of? And you think of the word Christian. They don't come up with fruits of the Spirit. They come with hypocritical, judgmental, phony. So we started thinking, okay, what's caused this disconnect? Why does the culture look at us so differently than we look at ourselves? And we went to the 4 biggest research organizations in America: Lifeway, Barna, Pew, Gallup. And we studied how Christians actually live their lives. And the results we found almost mirror identically to what's happening here in Australia. We looked at 4 key areas. We didn't take the hard stuff. We didn't pick fasting or mission trips. We just picked 4 easy places, baseline things about how Christians behave. We picked church attendance, Bible reading, prayer, and giving. And what we found really shocked us. I mean, after all, we're media guys. We're marketing people. We thought, the problem with engaging the culture is just a marketing problem. Like these examples I showed you earlier, we're not telling our story well. I mean, after all, we're marketing experts. We think marketing is the answer to everything. Your house is too small? No problem. Call it cozy. We can come up with a marketing solution to everything. But once we started looking at how Christians actually live their lives, we found it's not a marketing problem. It's much, much deeper. Let me give you some examples. Let's start with Bible reading. Now, first of all, let me go back and say that in both the U.S. and Australia, about 80%, roughly, it depends on the poll you look at, but about 80% of people say they believe in God. That doesn't mean they're Christians, but that means they will acknowledge there's probably a God out there. A little smaller number, between 70 and 80%, would actually identify as a Christian. Doesn't mean they show up in church. We started looking at that 70% and discovered on a typical Sunday, of that 70%, only 20% are actually showing up in church. A lot of people call themselves Christians in this country. Very few actually show up on Sunday. So I wanted to look at those people. People actually show up in the pews. Let's see how they're living their lives as Christians. You know what we found out? Bible reading. When it comes to reading the Bible, we discovered that 40% of church-going Christians today read the Bible rarely or never. Think about this for a minute. Almost half the people in church today, half the Christians in this country, the serious ones, we'd say, read the Bible. Now, here's the deal. The Bible, what is it? It's God's plan for eternity. It explains to us who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. It's our destiny and purpose. It explains the meaning in our life, and yet we think so little of the Bible today that 40% of us read it rarely or never. Church attendance, that's kind of interesting. The bar today is so low with church attendance, we discovered that you show up just 19 times a year, you're now considered a regular. A regular, 3 out of 8 Sundays, you show up, you're considered a regular. Prayer is interesting. We found a statistic that indicated 63% of church-going Christians believe prayer is important. We thought that's pretty good until we realized the flip side means that 37% of church-going Christians don't believe prayer is important. That's more than a third of the Christians in this country don't believe prayer matters. And then giving is pretty brutal. You can imagine that. And we found out that less than 10% of people in the pews actually give 10% to their church. Now, those are the same people that probably spend a fortune on hunting, spend a fortune on water sports, stuff that they love. But when it comes to church, we're not doing too well. So what we discovered is when it comes to the way the world looks at us, we may get mad at the gay community, or we may get mad at Hollywood, or the transgender crowd, whatever crowd of the day it is that we want to get upset at. We started thinking, wait a second, the names that they call us, hypocritical, phony, judgmental, are exactly right. They're exactly right. We discovered the bottom line is the greatest challenge to Christianity today is not the rise of secularism. It's not radical Islam. It's not the gay community or Planned Parenthood. The greatest threat to Christianity in the world today is Christians, because we're not living the life that actually God has called us to live. I don't know if that deserves applause or not, but it's horrifying. Let me tell you this. Christians today have become the fat guy in the gym that lectures everybody else about health. You know that guy, right? Yeah. We discovered that, working out is really hard. Wearing yoga pants is pretty easy. And most Christians today are simply wearing yoga pants. And we wondered, how did we get this way? Where did this come from? What happened? Well, we discovered something interesting. We believe that we have become the greatest and most sophisticated idol makers in the history of the world. We don't think ourselves as worshiping idols. We look at the Israelites back in the Old Testament and the book of Exodus and think, those guys were idiots. What were they thinking? And I know when Pastor Mark goes on vacation, you guys don't build a golden calf in the lobby of the church, right? But you know what we discovered? We discovered that we've kind of molded God into our own image. We worship a God that looks a lot like the God of the Bible, but this God understands why we don't have time to come to church. We're busy. He gets that. He understands why we don't have time to read the Bible, because we've got our career, we're studying, we're trying to move up the ladder to work. We've got other things to do, but this God understands that. This God understands why I'm cheating on my wife, because she's gotten kind of old and grumpy, and after all, this God wants me to be happy, right? We discovered that most Christians today have fashioned God out of their own lifestyle instead of conforming our lives to fit the life that God's called us to live. So it's interesting. I started looking back for what culture, what time in history did we ever live in a way that changed the world? And I know many of you would say, wait a second, I'm not that person. I'm showing up here on Sunday night. I take it seriously. I read the Bible. I give. I pray. But the truth is, when so many Christians are dropping the ball, we all get painted with the same brush. You start to understand why culture looks at us as one group. A few years ago in the United States, we had a huge steroid scandal in Major League Baseball. And the truth was, only a handful of players were taking steroids, but the entire league got painted with the same brush. That's happening today in the church, because so many of us are dropping the ball. So I went to find, okay, when was the church as a whole really making an impact in the culture? And in my book, I started researching, and it took me all the way back to the first generation of Christians. I found out something really interesting about the first generation of Christians, what we call the early church. It's interesting that those guys had no power, no influence, no money, certainly no political power. They were persecuted. They were hunted down. They lived most of the time in hiding. But they made an impact that was absolutely remarkable. And I looked at how they did it, and I found out some really interesting issues. One of the big issues in the Roman Empire was infanticide. They had no regard for life whatsoever. In fact, when a child was born, typically the Romans would not even name that child for 2 weeks, because sometimes it took that long to decide if we wanted to keep it or not. Most often, if it was a girl or another mouth to feed, if they didn't want the baby when it was born, they would take it to the city wall or beyond the city wall and just leave it. Let it die an agonizing starvation death, because they just didn't want that child. So common in the Roman Empire that we still have existing letters from Roman soldiers in the field writing back to their wives saying, look, when the baby's born, if it's a girl, just expose it. So incredibly common. But the Christians hated it. They knew every child is born in God's image, but what could they do? What could they do? They had no power. They couldn't pass a law against it. They couldn't even complain. But they could act. Under cover of night, these crazy Christians would go out and they would find these abandoned children on the city wall, beyond the city wall, in fields and by the side of the road, and they would take them in. They would raise them as their own child and their own family, and other members of the church would contribute money to help pay for the expense of raising that child. The Romans had no concept for why anybody would do this. They just abandoned that child because they didn't want it. Why would anybody want to take that child in and raise it as their own? I mean, they just couldn't wrap their head around it. Other issues would come up, like the plague. The plague was a huge problem in the first century. But when the plague hit, the Romans were famous for getting out of town as fast as they possibly could. In fact, they would leave their family members sick and dying by the side of the road just to get away. But Christians would go to the heart of the plague, ministering to people they didn't even know at the cost of their own life. So many things like this added up over time that the Romans started thinking, who are these people? It actually forced the Romans to rethink who these people are and who the God is they serve. Historians today will tell you that caused such a dramatic shift in the Roman Empire that within a remarkably short time, Christianity became the dominant religious faith in the Western world. It wasn't because they got mad at people. It wasn't because they outvoted people. It wasn't because they got angry. It wasn't because they boycotted anybody. They couldn't do any of those things, but they could serve. They could do what the Bible actually says. And that was so dramatically different. It changed the way the Romans looked at the world and looked at them and looked at who this God was they served. So ultimately, my question in my book is, what are the things we could do today that would so baffle this culture it would force them to rethink who we are and who is this God we serve? I mean, after all, politics hasn't worked. Anger strategies hasn't worked. Boycotts hasn't worked. What if we started doing things that actually baffled the culture? And I mentioned six or eight things in the book. For instance, in the U.S., the foster care program is a huge problem. Do you call it foster care here? It's a huge problem. We have 400,000 foster kids in America. Do you know that the statistics are that less than 1% of foster children ever graduate from college? The vast majority of foster care kids get pregnant within 3 or 4 years of leaving the program, and they just perpetuate the cycle. There's some wonderful families doing amazing things with foster care, but the truth is it's a broken system. We looked at that and thought 400,000 kids just in America. I don't know how many of them are here in Australia, but we thought that's an overwhelming problem. And then we realized, hey, wait a second. In America, there's 350,000 churches. What if we just took one kid per church? And maybe some bigger churches might take a couple kids. We started to realize that if the church got serious about this issue, we could eliminate the foster program within a year. And let me tell you something. How would the culture view us as believers if we, because of the church, eliminated foster care? How would they view you here in Australia if you did something similar? And then there are other suggestions we make in the book. Some are individual things. That foster care idea is a big capital C church idea, but there's so many little things. We have a thing in the U.S. We have an online want ad thing. We call it Craigslist. Anybody ever heard of Craigslist? I think you have your own thing like that here. We took a friend of mine, my co-writer of the book, took an ad out about 5 or 6 years ago on Craigslist a week before Christmas and said, if you're struggling making Christmas happen for your kids, your family, let me know. I'd love to help. He got 3 single moms responded that year. And he and his wife, Kelly, met them at a department store out in the public place near town so they wouldn't be afraid. They met these ladies and they got 3 grocery carts and they went through the store and loaded up toys, clothes, gave them each a $100 gift certificate for a grocery store for food. Those 3 women had the best Christmas they'd ever had in their whole life. The next year, John got my wife, Kathleen, and I together. We went over and did it, took our daughters over and helped us do it. This past Christmas, 17 people from the entertainment industry in Hollywood met at that Target. He had 17 families. Some were single moms, some were single dads, some were grandparents raising their grandkids. We each paired them all up with one of our couples, and we took them through the store. And the letters we've gotten back in all those years have been absolutely remarkable. Pictures of families at Christmas time. What's interesting is we don't have to witness to them because they want to know why you do this. Why do you do this? In fact, we've done it for so many years now. Department store employees will come up to us and say, look, guys, we see you every Christmas doing this. What is going on? It gives us an opportunity to share our faith with that crowd. There's so many things like that we talk about in the book that you could do. And I'd encourage you, what are the things you could do in your office, your church, your street? I read a statistic the other day that said vast numbers of people in this country have no idea who their neighbors are. have never met them, never been to talk with them. I wonder how many of you sitting here, if your friends at work don't know that you're Christian. That's a huge number. Lots of people exist who their friends have no idea they're believers. Let me tell you something. We could shift the culture if we started doing stuff like that. So all I wanted to do is come by tonight and share a little bit about that book and let you know that I think the single greatest way we can shift the culture here in Australia is to start doing things that absolutely astonish and baffle people. Force them to rethink, wait a second. I thought these guys were hypocrites. I thought they were phonies. I thought they were power hungry. I didn't realize they did this or they did that. If we could do that stuff, and let me just say one final thing. I don't want to take much time. Let me tell you one final thing. I think the key to all this, where you go from here, is being faithful. Somehow we've forgotten what the Bible's actually called us to do with our lives. That's why I was so excited about seeing these students here tonight. They're being reminded every day when they go into class how much the Bible has called us to change our lives and live differently than the rest of the culture lives. One sociologist at Baylor University in the U.S., Rodney Stark, has done research that indicates the single biggest reason people convert is because they want to be like those people. When I think of how badly we live out our lives as Christians, why would anybody want to be like us? If miracles aren't happening, if we're not living a victorious life. I went into a bookstore the other day and I looked at the Christian section and it looked like a self-help section. I mean, there was nothing triumphant there. It was, Lord, how do I get through my divorce? What does the Bible say about remarriage? What does the Bible say about financial success? What does the Bible say about turning my life around? How sad! If we're not living a life that the culture wants to be like, why do they want to be like us? Let me tell you something. It's all about being faithful to what God's called us to do. It's about being faithful to get back in the Bible. It's about being faithful about showing up in church. It's about being faithful in worship and prayer. You start by being faithful. Let me tell you a little quick story and I'll quit. In my 20s, I had a really interesting opportunity. I got to go to Africa to film a major project there. While I was there, I met an African evangelist. His name was Nicholas Bingu. They called him the Billy Graham of Africa. In fact, Time magazine gave him that title, the Billy Graham of Africa, because he had led more Africans to Christ than any other African in history. He's a remarkable man. Hundreds of thousands of people he had led to Christ in his career. And so I got to sit down with him and I got my cameras and I wanted to do an interview with him on film. And I asked him, I said, tell me about that. You've led more Africans to Christ than any man in history. Tell me what that's like. He was an incredibly humble guy, and he said, let me tell you a different story. And he took me back many years earlier to a young missionary couple that came from the States to Africa. They were all excited. They were in their 20s. Their church organization had sent them over to be missionaries. They were pumped. They were ready to go. The problem was they apparently weren't very good at it. They would preach. Nobody would come. They would go out and, work in villages. Nobody cared. Literally, nobody converted under their ministry. Years went by. They would come back to the States to raise money. Can you imagine trying to raise money for your mission outreach? You don't have one single convert to report. But they were faithful. They went back. They built a church nobody came to. They were terrible at being missionaries. In fact, after 10 years of being there, the only person they even made a relationship with was a little African kid helping them carry their gear, their equipment. But nobody, not one single convert. Finally, years later went by, more years went by, and their church organization called him up and said, look, we can't keep supporting this. You don't have one single convert, not one salvation. So the church said, you got to come home. You talk about embarrassment. You talk about humiliation. They were broken. In fact, in those days, they traveled by boat. And Nicholas told me that when they got to the dock, literally after spending 20 years in the mission field, the only person to see them off was that little kid. That was it. They came back to America. They were so depressed, so determined that they had completely failed, wasted their life, wasted their ministry. It wasn't but a few years before they both died. That's when Nicholas Bingu looked at me and said, what they didn't know was I was that little kid. He said, God didn't send them over to reach 1,000 people or 500 people or even 10 people. He sent them over there to reach me. And since that time, I've led more people to Christ here in Africa than any man in history. Let me tell you something. You don't need to keep score in this life. God does. And if we could just be faithful, we don't have to launch big evangelistic campaigns. We don't have to make a big stink in the press. We don't have to have big politicians. All we need to do is be faithful. And if you can do that, I'm convinced that people will come up to you in heaven and tap you on the shoulder and say, you remember back then you did this, you did that. You held that block party on your neighborhood. I was one of your neighbors and I'm here because you did that. Simple things like that that will change the culture are things that I think will astonish them, will baffle them. It's all about being faithful.